We are told from basically the moment we set foot in a classroom that the path to success is built on one thing: specialization. Pick a lane, major in something incredibly specific, get that advanced degree, and just become the absolute best in one tiny sliver of the world. Charlie Munger, the intellectual powerhouse behind so much of Berkshire Hathaway's success, says that entire way of thinking is, well, he says it's a dangerous lie. He calls it the man with a hammer syndrome. The idea is, if you only know finance, or you only know law, or you only know engineering, you're not just limited. You're actively dangerous when a complex real-world decision hits your desk. And here's the kicker. The smarter you are, the better you get at convincing yourself your hammer is the only tool you need. That high IQ just becomes a high horsepower engine for rationalizing your way into, well, a catastrophe.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. That's a pretty blunt claim. And frankly, it's a little frustrating to hear if you're someone who has spent, a decade and a ton of money becoming a specialist. I mean, look around. Nobel Prizes, huge innovations, the people running massive companies, they're almost all deep experts. We build our entire economy on specialization. So what's the deal? I mean, if I need brain surgery tomorrow, I absolutely want the person who has done nothing but that one procedure for 20 years. You wouldn't want a generalist brain surgeon, would you?
And that is the perfect question. It's the exact distinction Munger makes, and it's where he thinks, modern education totally misses the point. He draws a very sharp line between simple, repeatable tasks and complex strategic decisions. For tasks, specialization is king. A surgeon's skill with a scalpel, an engineer running a specific stress test.
Yeah.
That's where deep expertise is incredibly efficient. It's an execution multiplier.
But the decision of whether to operate in the first place, or the analysis of all the other risks involved, the psychological factors, the financial side, the family dynamics, that's where the hammer fails.
Precisely. In those moments, the specialist becomes what Munger pretty brutally calls a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You need to pull in ideas from physics, from psychology, from economics, from history, just to properly see the problem before you even think about picking up your specialized tool. So our mission today is to, break out of that silo, dismantle this myth of the all-powerful specialist, and unpack Munger's actual solution for being rational in a complex world. It's this idea of the multidisciplinary latticework of mental models, pulled straight from his book, Poor Charlie's Almanack.
Okay, so this isn't about being a jack of all trades, master of none. It's about building a better framework so you can avoid shooting yourself in the foot. All right, let's get into it. This is the deep dive from Nonfiction Insights, and today we're looking at the foundational principles that Charlie Munger says are just essential. Essential for basic rationality and for making sure your own expertise doesn't make you a fool.
So let's start with the core problem. The reason man with a hammer is so dangerous in the first place. Munger has a fundamental rule. You can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try and bang them back.
That sounds simple, but it's a huge shot at how most of us were taught. Rote memorization, cramming for a test. That's how you get through school, right?
It is. But Munger sees those facts when they're isolated as totally useless. He has this great metaphor. He says facts separated from a theoretical structure are like raisins scattered on a table.
Okay.
They just roll around. They can't connect. They can't form a coherent picture of anything. The theory, the mental model, that's the cookie dough that holds the raisins together. It gives them structure. It makes them into something usable, something predictive.
And without that structure, your brain just can't handle the fire hose of information the world throws at you. You can't see the second-order consequences of your actions if you're only looking at one little piece of the puzzle.
Right. Now let's really define the man with the hammer syndrome, because it's so much more than just being ignorant of other fields. It's a structural flaw in thinking. It's driven by a bunch of subconscious psychological tendencies that basically guarantee the narrow expert will be incompetent outside their little box.
So we need to figure out what's forcing them to keep swinging that hammer, even when the problem is clearly a screw.
The first piece is the most obvious one, and it's external. It's incentive cause bias. The person's entire livelihood, their reputation, their status, their identity, it's all tied up in that hammer. If problems stop looking like nails, he doesn't get paid. His status goes down. His whole reason for being at the table disappears. The incentive structure literally dictates how he sees reality.
But Munger's point is that the really powerful stuff is happening inside your own head, right? It's internal.
Exactly. That's the consistency and commitment tendency. This guy has spent decades, thousands of hours, a massive emotional investment in becoming the hammer guy.
Right.
To just put the hammer down and admit it's the wrong tool for the job, that would be a huge admission of error. And our brains are basically hardwired to resist that at all costs. We hate admitting we were wrong.
So the external incentives and the internal biases all point in the same direction. They create this feedback loop of self-justification that becomes so powerful, it's almost impossible to see the world as it actually is.
Becomes a bubble. And Munger gives this brilliant, almost painful example of it from his own world investing. He talks about the followers of Benjamin Graham. Now, Graham was Warren Buffett's teacher, a legend. He taught this very specific style of value investing.
In the cigar butt approach, right?
Yeah.
Find assets that are so ridiculously cheap, they're basically free money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Munger calls it the Geiger counter approach. You just scan the market rubble, and when the counter clicks, you found an asset trading for way less than it's worth, which gives you a huge margin of safety.
But the world changed. And in the late 60s, 70s, those super obvious dirt cheap bargains, they started to disappear. The market got more efficient. The Geiger counter stopped clicking.
So what did these devout Ben Graham followers do? They were specialists. They had one system, one hammer.
They couldn't just abandon it. That would mean their whole life's work was suddenly obsolete.
Right. So instead, Munger says they just changed the calibration on their Geiger counters. They started redefining what a bargain was.
Wow. So they went from finding companies that were objectively mathematically cheap to ones that were kind of cheap or had a good story that might make them cheap in the future if everything went perfectly.
Precisely. They kept moving the goalposts so they could keep doing the same activity they'd always done. They did it just to protect their professional identity and their comfortable routine. It's the perfect illustration of how specialization, when it's too deep, just fights against reality. The Graham system was beautiful for its time, but its followers couldn't adapt because their whole mental toolkit was stuck in the past. They were blind to new ideas like brand power or management quality or psychology that were becoming the real drivers of value.
So that's the divide. If you're a plumber in a small town, doing repetitive tasks, specialization is great. It's efficient.
Of course, but the minute you're facing a big, messy decision, allocating capital, changing careers, a complex family problem, that narrow focus becomes a huge liability. You might be the world's best expert on one variable, but you completely miss the other 9 that actually determine the outcome. You need the latticework.
Okay, so the antidote to this hammer's blindness is the latticework. Let's really flesh this out. We're talking about building an actual structure in your mind, right? Where facts can hang together on a latticework of theory.
Correct. And that structure is built from mental models, the big unifying ideas from all the major disciplines. And Munger's key point here is this is not about getting 5 PhDs. It's about developing a working fluency in the principles that govern reality.
The big ideas, not the tiny details.
Exactly. And especially where those principles overlap and interact. Munger estimates you really only need maybe 80 or 90 important models, and those will do about 90% of the work for you. But to get them, you have to do what he calls jump the jurisdictional boundaries that academia and business have set up.
Because if you only live in your own little world, say corporate finance, you're completely blind to the huge forces from physics or biology or psychology that are actually driving everything. I think it was the biologist Julian Huxley who said something like, life is just one damn relatedness after another.
That's the perfect way to put it. The disciplines have to talk to each other inside your head. So let's break down where Munger gets these models. We can sort of group them into 3 buckets, from most reliable to least.
Okay, so what's in bucket number 1, the most reliable ideas?
That would be hard science and engineering, physics, chemistry, things like that. And the reason they're so reliable is that they have the biggest data set possible, 13.7 billion years of the universe existing. These laws don't change. They're time invariant.
They're the bedrock.
They are. And from physics, you get these incredibly powerful concepts. Take critical mass. In physics, it's about compressing enough fissile material until you get a self-sustaining exponential chain reaction, a nuclear explosion.
And applied to business or life, it's a tipping point. It's where different forces combine, and the effect isn't just additive, it becomes multiplicative. It just explodes.
Yes. You might have a decent idea, a good product, and okay marketing. 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. But when those things hit a critical mass of network effects or social proof, the result isn't 3. It's 100. It's 1,000. Munger's genius was often in seeing when a situation was about to hit that critical mass, not just grow in a straight line.
Another one you mentioned from this bucket is scale effects. This is one that trips people up all the time.
It's so counterintuitive. We assume that if something works when it's small, it will just work bigger. But Munger stresses that as things scale, they change fundamentally, often for the worse. The classic example is a cube. As a cube gets bigger, its internal volume grows way faster than its surface area.
Okay, so the inside grows faster than the skin.
Right. And in a company, the volume is all the internal complexity, the bureaucracy, the inertia. The skin, the surface area, is the management layer trying to control it all. So as the company scales, that layer of management becomes totally inadequate for the massive volume of bureaucracy it's supposed to manage. It's why big organizations naturally become slow and dumb, even if they started out lean and fast. The physics of the system just changes,
And then there's engineering, which gives us ideas like margin of safety.
which is absolutely essential for decision-making. It's not just for building bridges. An engineer designs a bridge to hold 100 tons, but builds it to withstand 150.
In your life, that means never cutting it close. It means having a huge buffer against failure, whether it's financial, emotional, whatever. It's an asymmetric defense against disaster.
Okay, let's move to the second bucket.
Yeah,
Is-
mathematics and probability. Munger says this is just fundamental truth that almost everyone, especially in business, ignores. We're not talking about crazy high-level math. We're talking about the Fermat-Pascal system of probability. It's basically high school algebra applied to real life.
And yet, how many incredibly complex financial models have blown up the world because the quants who built them forgot basic probability? It leads to simple but powerful tools like decision tree theory, which they teach at Harvard Business School.
And the students are always shocked, right? They've learned all this insane calculus, and then they find out that just mapping out choices and probabilities on a branching tree is one of the most powerful tools there is for dealing with uncertainty.
But Munger's favorite application here is the pari-mutuel system, the racetrack.
The ultimate metaphor for how markets work.
It is. The system takes all the bets, all the collective wisdom and bias of the crowd, and sets the odds automatically. Any idiot can look at the horses and spot the best one. Great track record, lightweight, good post position.
But if everyone knows it's the best horse, everyone bets on it, and the odds plummet. So maybe that great horse pays 3-2, while some long shot is paying 100-1. The simple math of probability tells you that the obvious physical winner is probably not the best bet.
The price changes the game. That's the insight. You can be 100% right about the quality of something, a stock, a company, whatever. But if the price already reflects that quality, your edge is gone. The odds are against you. That's why he and Buffett wait for that rare mispriced bet where the odds are massively in their favor and then they bet big. They don't just gamble against the house every day.
Okay, and that brings us to the third and final bucket. This is where it gets more human.
This is biology and psychology. Biology is next in reliability after the hard sciences because, our basic genetic programming is pretty consistent across the species. Natural selection, survival instincts, those are powerful, predictable forces. But the real master key, according to Munger, is psychology. He says it is ungodly important. He insists that the most useful part of psychology, the 25 or so principles of human misjudgment, can be taught to any reasonably smart person in a week.
And he's mad that he had to learn it himself, right? He went to Caltech and Harvard Law, and they taught him nothing about it. He had to figure it all out the hard way later in life. So why is it so vital?
Because if you don't understand the bugs in your own cognitive software, you are a walking target. You're a patsy waiting to be manipulated, whether it's by a salesman, a politician, or just your own subconscious screwing you over.
Okay, so let's dig into that, this checklist of misjudgment. Because Munger sees this as the absolute core of rationality.
He does. It's the checklist you have to run before any major decision. And these biases are so insidious because they're invisible to the person who has them. Munger's great analogy is carbon monoxide. It's odorless, it's invisible, and it is fatal if you ignore it.
Yeah.
You don't even realize you're being poisoned by your own irrationality until the house is already burned down.
And the smarter you are, the worse it is. Because a high IQ just means you're better at coming up with clever reasons for your dumb decisions. It's a tool for self-deception.
Which is so much more dangerous than simple ignorance. Let's go back to the cornerstone bias Munger always starts with, incentive-caused bias. He thinks this is the most powerful force in the world, showing how incentives just steamroll rationality and even morality.
The story about the doctor it's chilling.
It is. This doctor in Nebraska was sending, quote, bushel baskets full of normal gallbladders to the pathology lab. He was taking out healthy organs for money. But when a friend of Munger's, another doctor, was asked about it, he said, hell no, Charlie, he's not a con man. He genuinely thought that the gallbladder was the source of all medical evil.
Wow. So he convinced himself. His brain literally rewrote his reality so that his greedy actions felt like a moral crusade. The incentive didn't just make him greedy, it made him believe his greed was noble.
That's the terrifying power of it. But you see the same power in reverse when you fix the incentives. Look at the Federal Express example. Their whole system depended on a night shift that sorted all the packages at a central hub. And it was always a disaster. The shift could never get the work done on time. They tried everything, moral lectures, threats, management consultants. Nothing worked.
Because they were paying by the hour. So the incentive for the workers was to make the job take as long as possible.
Exactly. The solution was blindingly simple. They just changed the incentive. They started paying a fixed amount per shift, and the problem vanished. Overnight, the workers started helping each other, finding efficiencies, and they were often done in half the time. It just shows that incentives will beat moral lectures every single day of the week. Never, ever underestimate incentives.
Okay, what about another one? A bias that's maybe a little more subtle.
Let's talk about Pavlovian association and authority misinfluence. We touched on the CBS case with its founder, Bill Paley. Paley was a god at the network, but he had this fatal flaw. He hated hearing bad news. So what do you think happened?
The employees learned really, really fast. Only tell the boss what he wants to hear.
Exactly. They learned the Pavlovian rule. Bad news is associated with pain, good news with pleasure. So a management cocoon of unreality, as Munger calls it, formed around Paley. All the critical negative information got filtered out before it ever reached him. And the system around him started to rot because there was no accountability. No one wanted to be the messenger who got shot.
So what's the antidote to that? How do you stop yourself from becoming Paley?
You need what Munger calls objectivity maintenance routines. And the gold standard for this is Charles Darwin. Darwin knew how the human mind works. He knew it loves to hang on to its own ideas. So he deliberately trained himself to fight that tendency. Whenever he came across a piece of evidence or an argument that contradicted one of his beloved theories, he made it a rule to pay extra attention to the disconfirming evidence. He would write it down immediately because he knew his brain would naturally try to forget it or ignore it. He actively hunted for the data that proved him wrong.
That is such a powerful takeaway. You have to be your own biggest critic. If you have a strong belief about an investment, a career choice, whatever, the most valuable thing you can do is go searching for the smartest people who hold the opposite view.
It's the only way to stay sane. And now let's look at the positive side, how you can actually use this knowledge of psychology for good. The Captain Cook in the sauerkraut story is the all-timer.
Right. So Cook knew sauerkraut prevented scurvy, the disease that killed sailors on long voyages, but sailors were, notoriously stubborn about eating strange new foods.
He couldn't just order them to eat it, and he couldn't tell them the real reason, that they were going on such a long voyage that they were all likely to get scurvy, because that would cause a panic, maybe even a mutiny. It was a leadership problem that couldn't be solved with authority. It required psychology.
So what did he do? He used this brilliant trick.
He used two biases at once. He started by serving the sauerkraut only to the officers at their table in full view of the crew. For a while, the regular sailors weren't allowed to have any. Then he announced they could have it, but only one day a week.
Ah. So he created scarcity, or what Munger calls deprival superreaction. And he used social proof. The high-status officers were all eating it. The forbidden food suddenly became this desirable, high-status thing. It became a privilege.
And they all started eating it. A simple move based on a deep understanding of two mental models. Probably saved hundreds of lives and guaranteed the success of one of the most important voyages in history. That's the power of the Latticework.
Okay, so we've looked at these biases one by one, but you mentioned that the real danger is when they start to combine.
This is where Munger's system gets really powerful and honestly a little scary. He calls it the Lollapalooza tendency. This is the idea of non-additive risk. It connects right back to that physics model of critical mass.
It's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's 1 + 1 = 10.
Or 100. When you get 2, 3, 4 of these psychological tendencies all pushing in the same direction, you don't just get a stronger effect. You get a runaway chain reaction that can just obliterate the rationality of even the smartest people.
So the true danger isn't that you have one little blind spot. It's that you get into a situation that triggers 4 of them at the same time.
That's why the lattice work is so critical. If you only see the world through a financial lens, you only see financial incentives. But if you start layering on social proof and reciprocity and commitment tendency, you suddenly realize the situation is way more dangerous than it looks. You can get mass delusion.
And the example of this is the Serpico corruption effect, named after the famous New York City cop who exposed all the corruption in his department.
It's a textbook Lollapalooza. It's not one thing that causes that kind of systemic rot. It's a combination of powerful forces all working together. First, you have the raw incentive, the easy money from the bribes.
Then you have social proof. Everyone else is doing it. Your partner, your boss, all the guys you respect. So it starts to feel normal. It must be okay if all these good guys are doing it.
And then, maybe the most powerful force of all, inconsistency avoidance. Once you take that first bribe, once you cross that line, your brain desperately wants to remain consistent with that action. To stop and admit that first act was wrong requires this huge psychological break. It means admitting you're a bad person, which is something the human mind will do almost anything to avoid.
So you have the money, the peer pressure, and your own brain's need to justify your past actions. That combination creates this unstoppable momentum that just crushes anyone who tries to resist, like Frank Serpico.
Right, and this doesn't just apply to police corruption. Munger saw the same Lollapalooza effects in corporate accounting scandals. A company makes one tiny, borderline unethical move. Then the need for consistency forces them to make a slightly bigger one to cover it up. And step by step, these brilliant people end up in what Munger calls a moral sewer, with no idea how to get out.
Which brings us to the danger of getting comfortable. The danger of hubris in complex systems. When big, successful organizations are on top of the world, they get, as Munger puts it, fat and foolish.
The margin of safety just evaporates. They start believing their own hype. And they forget the most important mental model of all, the circle of competence. Look at the Westinghouse disaster he always talks about. A hugely successful company making appliances and electrical equipment. Then they lose billions of dollars making incredibly stupid loans to real estate developers. Why?
Because they put the wrong person in charge. Someone who had no experience in that field.
Exactly. They took a guy who, Munger jokes, probably came up through the refrigerator division, and they put him in charge of these highly complex financial decisions. It was a wildly unequal contest. He was using the tools from his old specialty confidence, process management, and applying them to a completely different game he didn't understand. The result was a catastrophic, non-linear failure.
So the big lesson is, in any complex system, the #1 goal has to be avoiding the huge mistakes. Because these Lollapalooza effects show how a few small errors can combine and just blow the whole thing up. You have to play defense.
And that idea of playing defense brings us perfectly to Munger's master move, the single most powerful tool in his whole intellectual arsenal. It's inversion.
The subtractive method. This is a huge mental shift for most people. We're always taught to think about what to do, what to add to be successful. Munger says start with what to avoid.
It's what we could call strategic humility. He says real, long-term success comes not from moments of brilliance, but from consistently and systematically avoiding stupidity. And it's because large losses have what he calls an asymmetric effect on capital development.
The math is just brutal on this. If you have $100 and you lose 50%, you're down to 50. To get back to where you started, you don't need a 50% gain. You need a 100% gain.
It gets exponentially harder to recover from big mistakes. So the math itself demands that you focus on avoiding those big losses first, always.
And his mantra for this is simple. Invert, always invert. Instead of asking, how can I make this company successful, you ask, what are all the ways I could run this company into the ground? And then you just don't do those things.
It's his famous little quip, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a joke, but it's a profoundly effective way to solve problems. In mathematics, it's a known technique for solving things that are too hard to solve forwards. You just figure out all the paths to failure, and what's left is the path to survival.
Okay, so let's apply this. What's on Munger's inverted checklist for life? His checklist for a guaranteed miserable life? What do we need to subtract?
Number 1 on his list is ingesting chemicals to alter your mood or perception. He saw several of his smartest friends completely destroyed by this, especially alcohol. He says it just inevitably leads to a moral breakdown and denial. It destroys the self-awareness you need for the whole Latticework to even function.
Number 2 is envy and resentment. He quotes Buffett on this. It's not greed that drives the world, but envy. Munger says life is already hard enough. Why would you voluntarily swallow the bitter rind of resentment on top of it all? He says envy is the one sin that isn't even any fun. It's just pure poison with no upside.
Absolutely. Number 3 is to avoid unreliable partners and lack of trust. He says you should never work for someone you don't admire and never partner with someone you don't completely trust. Munger basically engineered his entire life so he would only work with and for people he respected, like Buffett. It just makes everything better.
And this extends to contracts, right? He hates complicated contracts. He tells a story about a 47-page prenuptial agreement.
He says what you want in any partnership is A seamless web of deserved trust. If you need 47 pages of legalese to protect yourself, the trust is already gone. The partnership is already broken. Just walk away.
And number 4, avoid systems with perverse incentives. Don't get into a game where you are rewarded for behaving stupidly or unethically. If your bonus is tied to just doing more transactions, regardless of the quality, you're in a perverse system. And his advice for getting out of those is basically, good luck.
He says, I don't have a solution for you. You'll have to figure it out for yourself. The only way to win those games is just not to play them. And all this inversion, it leads right back to that idea of the circle of competence.
Which is the boundary for everything.
It is. Winning, at the end of the day, is about being brutally honest with yourself about what your aptitudes are, and then playing strictly within that circle. You have to know where you have an edge, and just as importantly, where you are absolutely guaranteed to lose because you're up against people with a massive natural advantage.
He says if he had to be a professional musician, he'd be a total failure. But if you want to become the best plumbing contractor in Bemidji, Minnesota, he thinks 2/3 of the population could probably do that with enough discipline.
Exactly. That's the game most of us should be playing. Slowly, patiently building a real demonstrable edge in a defined area. Assiduity, as he calls it. If you keep trying to play games where other people have all the talent, Munger says, you're going to lose. And that's as close to certain as any prediction that you can make. Inversion tells you, avoid those games.
You know, the most striking thing about Munger's entire philosophy, when you lay it all out like this from poor Charlie's Almanack, is that it doesn't really require you to be a genius. It just requires discipline.
Yep.
And a real desire to see the world as it is.
That's it. You have to be a learning machine, and you have to be a master of your own psychology. Success is simple, he'd say, but it is not easy. It takes intense interest, and it takes his favorite word, assiduity. The discipline to just sit on your ass and do the work until it's done. So the final checklist for success really just boils down to 3 things. 1, build your lattice work. Go out and learn the big models from all the major disciplines. 2, run your checklist of human misjudgment constantly. Catch your own biases before a Lollapalooza effect gets you. And 3, invert every single important problem. Figure out how to fail, and then just don't do that.
And that focus on being rational rather than just being smart is so reassuring. The goal isn't to have the highest IQ in the room. It's to be the person who has done the work to build the right mental frameworks and mitigate their own flaws.
Which brings us to one final provocative thought from Munger. It's a test he uses to challenge anyone who claims to be an expert, and it's a test you have to use on yourself and the people you trust. He says there are 2 types of knowledge. First, there's Planck knowledge, named after the physicist Max Planck. This is the real deal. The person who actually knows the material, they pay the dues, they have the deep understanding.
And then there's the other kind, chauffeur knowledge.
Right. The story is that Max Planck's chauffeur drove him all over Germany as he gave the same lecture on quantum mechanics over and over. Eventually, the chauffeur had memorized it perfectly. One day he says, Professor Planck, it must be boring for you. Why don't you let me give the lecture in Munich? You can sit in the front row wearing my chauffeur's cap.
And Planck agrees, and the chauffeur gets up and delivers the lecture word for word perfectly. Until the end, when a physics professor in the audience stands up and asks a deeply technical follow-up question.
And the chauffeur, without missing a beat, says, I'm surprised that in a city as advanced as Munich, I would be asked such an elementary question. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to answer it. That's chauffeur knowledge. The person has learned the script. They sound impressive, but they lack the deep foundational understanding. They haven't paid the dues.
So the final challenge for all of us is to figure out which kind of knowledge we have. And more importantly, which kind of knowledge we're relying on in other people. Our doctors, our financial advisors, our leaders. We have to learn how to tell the difference between a real performance and just a performance.
That ability to distinguish competence from the mere appearance of it, that might be the final, most critical piece of the whole lattice work. To continue building your lattice work of mental models and distinguishing true expertise from mere performance, subscribe to the Deep Dive from Nonfiction Insights. We'll talk to you next time.